Sorry for my hiatus. I've gotten a new job which has taken up a lot of time, and I've been dealing with applying to grad school, but I will try to get back to making videos. So anyway, KnowNoMore responded to the version of the introspective argument I gave in my response to Martimer 81. So let's have a look.
Makes the distinction between mind and matter that you're trying to establish. You literally declared by fiat that mind is not material in your first premise.
Well, let's look exactly at what we mean by matter. Assuming we are on the same page, what we refer to when we speak of matter is anything beyond subjective perception. And since we cannot know of anything beyond subjective perception by definition, everything we know of when we speak of the mind is not that which we refer to as material. Hence, the mind is immaterial. In fact, in the words of Max Planck, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness.
Yeah, I know that you believe that, but that's the conclusion C1 you try to draw from the first two premises.
Well, maybe I shouldn't have phrased it exactly like that. A better way to phrase it is as follows. P1, our minds have the property that they could exist in a possible idealist world. P2, matter does not share this property. C1, thus by Leibniz's law, matter and mind are not the same thing. Now you might make the argument that the first formulation is question-begging, but I think the core intuition here is valid. And it's entailed in Cartesian skepticism in that Cartesian skepticism is based on the conceivability of idealism. You know that you can doubt the exterior world as a dream or such, but never your own mind.
Skepticism is simply the acknowledgement that you cannot deny the existence of your own mind, whatever the ontological nature of your mind happens to be, but that you do not have the same epistemic certainty about whatever may or may not exist external to your mind.
Well, like I said, perhaps I worded this version of the argument wrong. We can't doubt our mind, but our minds are also such that we can conceive of them while doubting everything else third person that could be said to make it up. If you doubt this, just recognize the internal logical consistency of a possible idealist world for a moment.
About epistemology and not about ontology. It's about existence versus non-existence, not material versus immaterial.
But the idea is that you can derive ontology from epistemology using modal logic. Well, you can't reduce the internal to the external, though. That's kind of the point behind Levine's explanatory gap. Everything internal can in principle be conceptually isolated from everything external, such that the external cannot reduce to the internal.
You know that something that you can label as I, or that which thinks, exists, but you do not have that same certainty about what may or may not exist external to this I.
We agree. Therefore, whatever the mind is, it cannot come from something external to this mentality, since we already know our own conscious experience.
You have epistemic certainty about the internal, at least regarding your immediate experiences, but epistemic uncertainty about the external.
Which is why I know whatever the mind is, it cannot reduce to something external. Otherwise, I would have epistemic certainty of the external.
This has nothing to do with ontology in the first place. Nothing about this, in and of itself, tells you anything about the ontological nature of what you consist of.
Well, let's look at a specific category of internal existence, knowledge itself. If knowledge is produced from non-knowledge, then we do not actually know what our own knowledge is, but that is a contradiction in terms.
Reality. In other words, that it has some sort of place in reality, but you don't even know what sort of place it has. Whether it's fundamental or not, or whether it's the only thing that exists.
This is sort of outside of the scope of the argument you are critiquing here, but let's take a look at that anyway. Is it possible for the mind to not be fundamental, but rather emergent? Well, if we consider that emergent things are only comprised of syntactical arrangements of fundamental things, this would be a problem if we want to argue that the mind has anything more than syntax. But as we can see from Searle's Chinese room, the mind must be more than syntax, and so the mind must be fundamental. And if we are both monists and believe in only one fundamental substance, we must conclude that the mental substance is the only fundamental substance.
Yes, you can doubt anything, including your own existence, but that very act of doubt already requires your existence. That's the point of Cartesian skepticism.
Right, but I was thinking along the lines of what else he did in getting to that point in the Meditations. The fact that he could coherently doubt the external world but not his mind means that his mind has a property that the external world does not, namely the property that it can be conceived of in a possible world wherein the external world is an illusion.
Premise 1. You believe God is fundamental, namely a metaphysical necessary being. Premise 2. I can doubt the existence of God. In fact, I very much do, and this is simply an incorrigible mental state. Premise 3. If I can doubt the existence of God, God's existence cannot be fundamental, which is simply your assertion that if you can doubt something, it cannot be fundamental. So, the conclusion would then follow that your belief that God is fundamental is false.
Right, but what I'm getting at is that when thinking about what your mind necessarily is, I just don't think you can do premise 2 coherently. A postulation of atheism requires consciousness. Consciousness in turn entails the hard problem and the interaction problem, which entail idealism and thus God. So, of course, atheism is incoherent. It's a kind of syntax error in consciousness. This is not to say that one cannot be an atheist and postulate premise 2, it's just to say that it is not coherent to do so.
You also confuse epistemic possibility with metaphysical possibility. You don't use those words, but you try to argue that since we can be certain of our minds, but not what may exist external to it, that which may exist external to it may in fact not exist at all.
I'm just saying that it's logically coherent to conceive of the external world as not existing even if the mind does, and that the mind has the metaphysical property that it allows for this. I'm not making metaphysical claims about the outside world in the first half of the argument.
Now you better have a pretty good excuse for making such a mistake, since I already pointed this out to you in my first video against idealism, and I know that you have seen that one.
I must confess I have not seen it in its entirety. I apologize for this. I've been meaning to get back to it for a while though.
And on top of that, you've misrepresented Cartesian skepticism, which I find ironic since Descartes believed in God like you do, believed in the same God as you do, believed in the immateriality of mind like you do, and you still misrepresented him.
Look, this little clip of the video was sort of off the cuff. Firstly, I wasn't meaning only the cogito, but the train of thinking leading up to it also. Secondly, I think the basic intuition was valid even if my exact formulation had issues. The ability to consistently doubt the outside world but not your mind could be restated in terms of a modal logic argument for the immateriality of the mind. If you want, though, I can replace the first part of the argument with any number of other fairly straightforward ones, be they Mary the Color Scientist, Plantinga's EAAN, Chalmers P-Zombies, etc., etc., etc.
But you will need to go beyond mere Cartesian skepticism to derive at conclusions about these subjects.
Okay, fair enough. I'm constantly tinkering with the introspective argument, and notice the parallel between Descartes being able to doubt the external world but not his mind, and the modal logic arguments based on possible solipsist, or if you reject that, possible idealist worlds. So I thought that maybe it could be tied directly to epistemology, but perhaps I'll just go back to modal logic arguments for that branch of variations of the IA then. Well, that's it. Talk to you later. If you liked this video, subscribe, and don't forget to check out my novel, Alaris, The Lances of Light, on Amazon Kindle in the description below. Now you can find us on Facebook at Idealism and Science versus Atheism. This mind is the matrix of all matter.